Welcome to Papa's Workshop. Today I am making this huge, gigantic countertop that is 5 feet by 7 feet. It is huge and it's made out of solid cypress, 2-inch thick, and these were 2-inch by 8-inch boards that was able to glue together. I did all of this without using a joiner, no real fancy tools, just a table saw and a few clamps. So let me show you how we did this today. So let's get started. The rough sawn cedar boards were dropped off at the doorstep, and it's time to be able to take them into the shop and get those edges cleaned up, because those were the rough edges. And I used this jig that I've used so many times before, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the description to the video showing how I used it. But what this allows me to do is set up the table saw and this jig so that I can cut off that rough edge just barely enough to leave a nice clean edge. And I have to be able to deal with those knots too. When I set these large boards up onto this jig, I need to make sure that it's secured and it's not going to move. So I put in some extra blocks on the back side so it does not move, as well as the clamps that I have on top. That way I can take it and run it through the table saw without having any problems at all. But this shows the completed setup ready to be able to run it through the saw. Since I don't have a jointer, to me using this jig with the table saw has proved to be the absolute best way to be able to true up the edges so that I can have some nice tight glue joints. This actually is quite simple to do because it now runs through the table saw just like any other board. But it does true up that edge. It makes it for a very nice straight edge that's 90 degrees, and it makes for a very good glue up joint. And of course you can see that it's throwing up a lot of sawdust. Looks like I'm going to need to add some dust collection to this table saw for ripping these long boards. I do have some ideas, so you should be seeing a design come up before too long in a future video. Here's a quick look at that edge, and it looks fantastic. It's a nice, sharp, clean edge that's perfectly 90 degrees, and that will make a very good joint. So let's go ahead and glue up these boards now. Pipe clamps are the perfect clamp for this type of glue up. The problem is that this one is so wide that I just did not have clamps that were wide enough, except for a couple, to make this large of a span. So what I had to do is get a little bit creative. Now this technique with the board at the end to be able to keep those joints nice and flat is a very common practice. Now believe it or not, I did have to move this whole big slab, and to be able to do that I used a Rockler Material Mate, and this rolling stand really made a difference. It was able to tilt right up. I was able to roll it out of the shop because unfortunately I needed that workbench for a little job. But now that I'm finished, I can slide this easily right back over onto the workbench and continue working. This Rockler Material Mate has made life so much easier to be able to handle these big slabs. And quite frankly, I was only planning on using it to move plywood. Never thought about something this big or this heavy, but it worked great. Now the next step in the process was that I had to take these small pieces and laminate those to this big slab also, to each side. And that would allow me to be able to get the full width that I needed. Now before I actually glue these last two strips on, I wanted to look at them very carefully and make sure that I had the best grain, best edges, and have it look as absolute best that I possibly could. And of course, this slab is heavy, as you can see me moving it to get a little bit more working room on the workbench. So now that I've got that, I'm ready to go ahead and get these glued up. Now I did want to make one final check just to make sure of the overall width, and we're good to go. Now for this glue up, I had to get even more creative. So what I did is I took a 2x4 and I clamped it down into the center of this big slab, and then I set up my clamps to be able to clamp from that 2x4 over to the edge. It certainly looks like I'm going to need to get some longer pipe clamps in the near future if I'm going to continue to do these type of projects, because these certainly were not long enough. Now it's also important to note, when I set up this clamp right here in the center and I had it on the workbench with that type of a handle, there was no way to be able to tighten it. It would just hit the table. So I just had to rearrange my clamps a little bit to one that was allow me to be able to tighten it. So this took a little bit of planning to be able to get set up and have everything dry fitted, and I knew it would work before I ever got the glue out. Now just for some extra security that I need to have, that 2x4 is only clamped on each end, and I needed to be able to have a little bit more security to make sure that that 2x4 would not move. So I added a clamp to this side to be able to hold that 2x4 in place to allow me to put the necessary pressure on that glue joint while it's set up. So now that I'm happy with the clamp arrangement, I believe that it's going to work just fine. So it's now time just to move them out of the way and position them so that I can go ahead and put the glue onto the wood and have the clamps readily available just to slide them in place and clamp it down tight. As you can see, these pipe clamps are a very, very valuable tool, and you can do some amazing things with them. Keep in mind that I could not think of any other way to be able to make this work short of actually going out and buying longer pipe, and I really did not want to do that. Although I use pipe clamps in the shop on occasions, it's not something that I use on a daily basis, so I really didn't want to go out and buy longer pipes for this. So I think this was a good workaround. Now I'll just add the Titebond glue, and I'm going to go ahead and spread it out to make sure that I have some real good coverage and plenty of glue. If it drips out, that's okay. That's not going to be an issue. The main thing that I want is to have real good coverage. And I don't mind adding some extra glue just to make sure that I have real good coverage. So you can see that it wasn't covered as well as I wanted. So I just went ahead and grabbed the bottle and added some more glue, spread it out, and that worked out real well. And a fancy spreader on top of that to be able to get the glue all nice and even. With all the clamps staged, this next step is actually real easy. I literally just rotate the board, slide it over into position, and grab the clamps and put them on. Now at first, you don't want it very tight. You can just snug it up just a little bit, and you're going to do that with each one of the clamps. And it doesn't take long to be able to do that, but this way you can position the board and get it exactly where you need to have it. And with both ends secured, then I can go ahead and take care of this center one and put it in place and tighten it. And then I'll go back and tighten up each one of them a little bit at a time until I get the pressure that I need. Now people will often ask, well, how tight should the clamps be? Well, they should be tight, but not overly tight. And I don't know any other way to be able to say it, because you do want to have it where the glue will have a chance to be able to bond to the other piece of the wood and to each other. But at the same time, you don't want it so tight that it squeezes out all the glue and there's nothing left. So there is a half a medium, and I don't really know any other way to be able to say it other than it comes with a little bit of experience and even some trial and error to get just the right tension on the clamps. I'm looking for is to be able to have an even tension across the entire length of the board and to be able to look for a little bit of that glue squeeze out along that joint. Now on this end, I need to be able to take care of this and make sure that it aligns up just right. And the easiest way to do it is to take a scrap piece of wood. Now I do put some cellophane tape on that or packing tape because that will not allow the glue to stick to it. But putting the two clamps into position, it brings that nice and flush, and that's all that's necessary. So here's a quick look at the entire glue up with all the clamps in place. Everything's under the tension and it's holding exactly the way it needs to be. And down there at the left you can see where that glue is seeping out just a little bit, and that's what I'm looking for. So now with all of that done, it's time to fill some gaps and do sanding and even more sanding. Now the goal of this was to leave it a little bit rough. There was some sawmill marks that we were able to leave, but there was also a lot of gaps and holes and cracks that we wanted to be able to fill in this wood while still leaving it a little bit rustic. So we mixed up some wood putty with the stain itself and used that to be able to fill it in, and then with just a couple of the belt sanders was able to sand it nice and smooth. Now you will notice we're going against the grain. This actually accomplished two things. I know this is not the norm, but it accomplished two things. It helped to be able to get the highs and the lows even between the different boards, and quite frankly, as we got closer to the end, we was able to put our own little sanding marks into the wood to make it look very natural. And that was again part of what we wanted to be able to accomplish, to be able to have a little bit of that rustic look, but yet have a smooth, flat surface. Now as far as the sandpaper, we were using the 80 grit paper for this whole process. Now here's a quick look at the finish of the sanding process. This board is flat, it's true, and all the joints and the cracks that we wanted to fill are filled, and it is ready to be able to stain. The other thing that I wanted to do is cut off those edges, and I didn't catch that on camera, but I just set up a board, a straight edge, and used a circular saw and cut that. And I wanted to verify that it was square, so with using the tape measure and setting it up on the diagonal, this is 101 inches and an eighth. So you can see that there. And then I'll set up on the diagonal on the other side and show you that this tabletop is 100% perfectly square. So if I hook the tape measure now on that end, this is going to be 101 and 1/8 of an inch also. Can't get any better than that. So I'm extremely pleased with the fact that this is a perfectly square tabletop. So I love how this is looking so far. The next thing I want to do is get rid of those sharp edges, and we're going to use a round over bit. The bit that I'm using is this 1/4 inch round over bit, and I'm going to use this in the trim router and run that all around the edges. Now when I use the trim router and I put these type of round over edges onto the different projects, I always like to be able to do the end grain first. Now that really only matters at the edges because it helps to prevent the tear out. But as long as I'm taking care of those ends and those corners so I can eliminate the tear out, I just go ahead and complete the entire end grain. And this is a habit that I have gotten into, and I have always been able to follow that. You don't want to have the wood tear out on the edges, on those corners, and this is one of the best ways to do that. And even on small projects, when I'm putting a edge on the wood, I always do the end grain first, and then I'll go and do the rest of it. The other thing that I want to be able to do is go on this vertical. I don't want those sharp edges on this project, so I can just take this trim router and just round over that edge as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and complete this all the way around this entire countertop. Now you also know that I'm going over this multiple times, and this helps to do a couple of things. It helps to literally burnish the edge a little bit as the bit goes over the same wood over and over, but it also helps to clean it up very nicely and reduce the sanding. So to me, this is a very important step to be able to do also. And again, I know a number of you have asked about that in the past, so I wanted to be able to explain it. Now, one word of caution: when you do these small vertical edges, you have to be very careful with the router and make sure that you're in a good position so that you do not cause a safety problem. But once that's done, I can just go ahead now and run the long ways with the grain, and this cuts very easy and actually very quickly. I like the edge. It makes it where it's a very finished look, and I think it's a perfect complement for this type of a rustic countertop. I wanted to get a little bit of a close-up for you just to be able to see how I deal with that corner. And the tear out that I'm trying to prevent is just at this edge, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this vertical portion also so that this corner is completely done. And then I'm going to go ahead and run the rest of this around. Now with all this done, it's time to get it stained. The staining was actually very straightforward. All I did is just took an old rag and applied the stain, and then took several clean rags and wiped off the excess. I wanted to have the color, but I also wanted to have that wood grain showing through, and I think that the results are absolutely amazing. Now that the stain is all dry, I'm going to come back with a water-based 3 coats of the polyurethane, and of course sanding between each of the coats, and this is just beautiful. Here's a close-up of the finished project ready to be delivered, and I wanted to show you the color is gorgeous, the wood grain showing through is just fantastic, and the saw marks and the sanding marks to be able to have it slightly distressed is perfect. And another project leaving the shop. Well, it's going to be a very special Merry Christmas for someone. So let me be the first to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.